Mr. Simmons, I represent Mr. Dempsey. You say you identified both the men in the dock as those who attacked you.
Yes.
And that one held you from behind in a full Nelson lock, whilst the other stood in front and rifled your pockets.
That's right.
Who stood in front of you?
Him.
Are you pointing at Mr. Langham?
The smaller one, yes, Langham.
Did you then get a good look at the man who stood behind holding you?
I recognised him.
But how? You say that Mr. Dempsey was standing behind you the entire time during the attack. How could you identify him?
Well, Mrs. Palmer did. I agreed with her.
Who picked out Dempsey first, Mr. Simmons, you or Mrs. Palmer?
Oh, she did, sir.
You agreed that Dempsey was one of the men?
Yes, sir.
Well, why did you agree with her?
Well, it was his scent, sir. He had some hair oil on. I recognised the smell. I could still even smell it on my coat.
My lord, there will be evidence that the hair oil worn by my client is very popular with black use at the club. It's a cheap brand that can be bought anywhere.
Yes, I'm still not quite clear about the identification. Mr. Simmons, if you weren't the first to identify the defendant, Dempsey, were you at least first with Langham?
Oh, yes, sir. No doubts about him.
Mr. Simmons, was the alley well lit at the point where this attack occurred?
No, it was quite dark.
Nevertheless, you identified these two men. While you were doing this, did anybody say anything to you before you made your selections, I mean?
Well, who, for instance?
Well, Constable Kershaw.
No, sir. No one.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons.
Mr. Simmons, I'm representing Mr. Langham in this case. You did identify both men, I take it? Or you hesitate?
Well, I definitely recognised him.
You're pointing at Mr. Langham?
Your bloke, yes.
Yes, but how could you be so sure?
Well, he was the one standing in front of me. He was the one going through my pockets.
Yes, but you've agreed with prosecuting counsel that you were held in a grip known as a full Nelson.
Well, if that's what they call it, I don't know.
But you say you looked directly at the man who stood in front of you.
Definitely.
Can I ask Mr. Dempsey to stand for a moment, please? You will agree, I think, Mr. Simmons, that Mr. Dempsey is considerably taller than you are.
I suppose so.
Yes, well, this is rather important, you see. My lord, may I demonstrate something to the court? I have my own subject.
I found you always come prepared, Mr. Simmons. Proceed.
Now, there's quite a difference in height between my instructing solicitor and myself. Almost as much as between Mr. Simmons and Mr. Dempsey. Now, if I apply a full Nelson to him and then exert pressure, because of the height difference, his head is forced downward. He cannot, in fact, look straight ahead of him. He can only look at his own feet.
Are you all right, Mr. Williams?
Yes, my lord. I apologize, my lord, and to my friend Mr. Williams, but my point could only be made by bringing pressure to bear upon the full Nelson. When the man in control is taller than his subject, the victim's head is necessarily forced downward. Now, Mr. Simmons, according to your evidence, you were able to look directly at my client, Mr. Langham. Can you honestly still maintain that?
It was him.
In the dark, pitch dark, terrified, in an incident that took less than a minute, you can truthfully say that you saw Mr. Langham long enough to be able to pick him out instantly at the youth club. When you and Mrs. Palmer went along the line, did you go together or separately?
Well, she came up behind.
Mm-hmm. And during this parade, did Constable Kershaw speak to you?
Not that I remember.
Thank you.
No further questions, my lord.
You may stand down, Mr. Simmons.
Call Mrs. Winifred Palmer, please.
Winifred Palmer, please.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on this card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You're Mrs. Winifred Palmer of 17A Forest Mansions, Birkin Road, Fulchester.
That's right.
Mrs. Palmer, how long have you lived in Fulchester?
Ever since I was a little girl.
Let us come now to what happened last November the 4th.
Those two young thugs jumped on Mr. Simmons.
Mrs. Palmer, please wait for my questions. You were walking down Clayton Street, I believe, into which the alley known as Paradise Way runs.
I was walking there, all right.
At about 9 o'clock.
Yes.
Now, taking it one stage at a time, and without rushing, will you tell the court in your own words what happened as you passed the alleyway?
Well, I was coming past the alley entrance when I was just about knocked dead over heels by them two big lads sitting there. They came out of that alleyway like nobody's business, not looking where they were going, mad-like. Well, I wasn't having that. What are you on, you great big lummox, I said, and I started hitting them.
With your...
With my umbrella. Oh, mind you, I didn't hit them very hard. I just sort of poked at them with the end.
You didn't want to hurt them?
Hurt them? I couldn't care less about that. Didn't want to break my new umbrella.
Go on, Mrs. Palmer.
Well, while I was doing that, I looked beyond them lads, and I saw Mr. Simmons lying on the ground. Oh, it was awful.
Did you know at once that it was Mr. Simmons?
Oh, no. How could I? All I knew, there was somebody lying on the ground, moaning like a dying animal.
Mrs. Palmer, you were laying about the two men who almost knocked you down.
Well, when I saw they'd bashed somebody, I got really mad. I mean, I've lived round here all my life. There's a lot moving, creating trouble, bashing innocent people.
Please, let's stick to the details of that evening, Mrs. Palmer.
Oh, sorry. Well, then them two lumps ran off, running for their lives, and I went after them. I was shouting to try to make somebody hear, but there's hardly anybody about. They were round that corner in half a tick.
I know this is a difficult question, but how long would you say you were fighting them?
Oh, they didn't get by me in a hurry, I can tell you.
Mrs. Palmer, how long?
Well, about a minute, at least. Oh, at least.
And during that time, did you get a good look at both assailants?
I did.
After the men made off, what did you do then?
Well, I came back to see the poor soul they'd bashed up, naturally. I was amazed when I saw it was Mr. Simmons. Poor old chap, he looked in an awful state lying there, moaning away.
Yes. Then what happened?
Well, thank the Lord he wasn't badly hurt, so I got him to his feet, and we went to look for Constable Kershaw.
Whom you found?
On the high street, doing his rounds, and I told him all about it.
And what did the officer reply?
He said he bet he knew where he could find them.
Where was that?
That youth club they run on the high street.
Now, that would be the youth club used by the young people in the area.
Aye, noisy devils, you can hear that black music a mile off, deafening row. Not that they care.
Mrs. Palmer, you must stick to answering my questions.
Sorry.
Did you go with P.C. Kershaw to the club known as the Kingston Beach Youth Club?
I did.
And what happened there?
They were there, all right, bold as brass.
Who were there?
Them two sitting there.
And how did you identify them?
Well, Constable Kershaw lined all the men up, and we picked them out right away.
So Constable Kershaw arranged for you, and I take it Mr. Simmons, to look at this lineup of young men.
Yes.
Now, was there any doubt at all when you selected the two defendants, Dempsey and Langham, from this lineup?
No, none whatsoever. I knew them right off, right away.
And you do see them in this court today?
Well, of course, that's what I've been saying all along. It's them two sitting over there.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Palmer.
You immediately recognise Mr. Dempsey.
Oh, well, which one's that?
Don't you know? Mrs. Palmer, could it be that in common with many other white people you find it hard to tell one black man from another?
My lord, that is an unwarranted assumption made by my learned friend on the basis of one innocent and reasonable reply from this witness.
Is that the nub of your cross-examination, Mr. Fry?
No, my lord, but it is an important aspect which I would have pursued later.
Yes, I appreciate you took what seemed an opportunity to bring the subject forward in your argument, but I should prefer you to deal, if you so intend, with the more material evidence first.
As your lordship pleases. Mrs. Palmer, you say that you fought with these two men for at least a minute.
That's right.
Now, I don't wish to take everything you say too literally, but could it possibly have been for less than a minute?
I said a minute, and I mean a minute.
And I'm sure you believe that. However, Mrs. Palmer, I'd like you to understand fully what a minute consists of. I don't intend to waste the court's valuable time, my lord, but let me time for you, Mrs. Palmer, what even a quarter of a minute is. 15 seconds, starting from now. "15 seconds, Mrs. Palmer. Now, are you saying that you fought those two men with the tip of your new umbrella, looking them firmly in the eyes all the time for a period lasting 4 times as long as that?"
Well, it was long enough to get a good look at both of them.
Did neither of the men retaliate?
Oh, bullies are all the same. When you give back what they hand out, they don't like it.
So you're saying that they did not hit you back. Now, coming to this so-called identity parade. During the parade, did Constable Kershaw say anything?
Not a word.
Nothing at all?
Nothing.
You seem very sure of that.
I am sure. I'd know them anywhere.
Thank you, Mrs. Palmer.
Mrs. Palmer, you've said that Mr. Simmons preceded you along the line. He went first.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Now then, how far behind were you?
Just behind, that's all.
Yes, but is it not true, Mrs. Palmer, that you and Mr. Simmons went along the line of youths virtually together?
No, he went first. He picked out Langham.
Was it not the fact that Mr. Simmons merely stopped alongside Langham to take a closer look, to think twice, to reflect carefully? And was it not that pause on his part that made you pick out Langham and say it was one of the men you saw?
I'm not blind. My eyes are as good as they were when I was a kid. I've never had any trouble with them. You ask anyone. If I say I saw him, I saw him. The same goes for the other one, too, the lanky one. Those were the two who done poor Mr. Simmons.
My lord, Mrs. Palmer is here as an eyewitness, and one who had a much better chance to look at and identify both assailants. Now, the suggestion made by my learned friend implies that she is not, that only Mr. Simmons, the victim, is thus qualified.
I agree, Mr. Elliot.
Thank you, my lord.
My lord, I don't concede the point, but perhaps I may return to it later. Mrs. Palmer, why were you out walking that evening?
No reason.
Now here I beg to differ.
Beg all you like, my lad.
The date was November the 4th.
Oh, so they say.
No, the day before Guy Fawkes Night.
That's a night to watch out for since they moved in.
They? I see. You mean that with all the fireworks and the bonfires and so on, things can get rather out of hand on the 5th of November. Sometimes even before the 5th, Mrs. Palmer. Sometimes even before the proper day.
I don't know about that, I'm sure.
I think you do.
I say I don't.
Is it not true, Mrs. Palmer, that on the evening of the 4th, some black children were playing with fireworks in the building where you live, dropping them down the stairwell and so on, generally making a nuisance of themselves? And isn't it true that when you came out to tell them off, you became extremely angry when they wouldn't take any notice of you? And so to stop them, did you not go and look for Constable Kershaw, whom you knew was on his beat in the area at that time?
Is that what happened, Mrs. Palmer?
They could have burnt the place down, your worship. Little black devils, they frightened the life out of my cat with them damn fireworks. She was half out of her mind. And when I went out to tell them off, they just loved the little...
So you did go out looking for Constable Kershaw?
Well, what's it matter why I was out? The fact is I was outside, and I did see them two young blacks beating up Mr. Simmons.
Mrs. Palmer, you did nothing of the sort. You did not actually see the attack take place. I put it to you, Mrs. Palmer, that despite Mr. Simmons' reticence, it was you who took him to the police. You insisted you went along to the youth club, and there, at the first opportunity, you instantly pounced on two boys and said that they were the men you fought with. You did all this, Mrs. Palmer, while in a furious rage against anyone black. And that is why I most seriously question the accuracy of your identification.
The case of the Queen versus Dempsey and Langham will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.